The first thing we need to understand is our own context, because we're doing these webinars. We don't often sort of step back and think about ourselves from the audience's context. So this is how it should look, right? Marketing and the subject expert and sales are all aligned. They're contributing their own parts to it. And you're just getting lots of meetings generated by lots of audience members who say, yeah, this call to action makes sense. This is what I should be doing. These are people that my company should know about, kind of stuff. Unfortunately, it tends to break up a bit. Each group has its own motivations and their own needs, their own upsides and potential downsides. And in the middle, of course, is the audience, who virtually nobody thinks about other than how do we get people registered and how many people attended. Right? That tends to be the only two thoughts most of us ever have about audiences, and it's a huge mistake. Now, to the audience, it kind of looks like this. The audience interacts with marketing. Marketing's kind of the middleman. They're also usually the provider of the platform, whether that's LinkedIn Live or GoToWebinar or Zoom Webinar or whatever. Marketing creates the registration pages. Marketing probably wrote what the automated emails are telling people and so on. And then through marketing, the audience gets to the subject expert, who is the person who's going to explain the complicated thing that the company does, which the audience suspects might be a match for a problem that they're trying to solve. And then, of course, there's sales on the other end of that. Sales oftentimes doesn't have much input into the creation, management, production, or anything else of the webinar. But of course, if the webinar is done right, sales is the ultimate beneficiary, or at least the next most immediate beneficiary, because they're going to get those meetings, they're going to get invitations, people are going to sign up for demos, whatever it is that we're trying to get them to do. In reality, it kind of looks like this, right? Marketing and sales have different goals for webinars typically, and the subject matter expert isn't particularly happy with any of them, and doesn't even want to think about the audience, because that's kind of terrifying. So we don't want to mess with that too much. The subject matter expert, of course, for the most part, this is not their job. You may have a CTO type group or sales engineer type group, but usually the audience wants to hear from someone who is a senior technical expert in whatever it is that the company makes or sells that's so complicated. So they do not want to hear from someone in marketing doing a webinar, usually. We talked about in the very, very first part of this whole thing, the introduction, how most of your audience is probably comprised of technical people, junior and mid-level, and even senior technical people. Rarely do you get an audience that's mostly populated by decision makers, CEOs, that kind of stuff. And so the subject matter expert is one of basically, he's their counterpart, or she's their counterpart to the audience. At same level, they're in similar fields in their respective companies. The subject matter is brought in to explain to the audience and show the audience why, what the company does or makes and why it's valuable. But it's not their real job. They'll tell you, this is not my real job. I mean, there's just nothing in their annual performance review that says, hey, yeah, not only did you solve these problems and do these things and manage these people for us, but I have a checkbox here for whether or not you were great at a webinar. There's no such thing. There's no such checkbox as great at a webinar. And so the subject matter expert has the highest potential downside if this thing fails. I mean, most of them are generally not comfortable in front of live audiences. Even people who are comfortable in front of live audiences who are in the room tend not to be comfortable with live audiences that they cannot see. You can't see. It can be really nerve-wracking, and it's often exhausting. I give a lot of them. I do, maybe 100 a year outside of what I already make for clients. And I kind of need a nap after every one of them too. I came from the technical side of the business and then went into sales and then went into marketing. And so if they do a great job, it's sort of a pat on the back. It's forgotten the next day. If they do a terrible job, they feel terrible. The whole thing was kind of a waste. They probably put a lot of time and effort into creating their presentation. And, this is a terrible feeling. The next is sales. The webinar can fail. Sales is not going to feel that today anyway. And of course, marketing. relatively little downside for any particular webinar failing. If a whole set of them doesn't seem to move the needle on something, it's really not great for marketing. They also have very little upside. Marketing's job in webinars is essentially the middleman, right? They're the platform. And if a lot of meetings come off of that, what marketing gets something to brag about. But really the problem is that if nothing happens, they can always say that they're building awareness. And so what you have is this very complicated problem where different organizations, 4 of them, if you include the audience, all have different goals, all have different needs, all have different risks for upside and downside, and they're not tightly coordinated. So what happens is you end up with something like webinars, business webinars, that have been around forever and yet see relatively little improvement year over year, decade over decade, because it's almost impossible to find an organization that sees the problem for what it is and knits something together to solve it. Or B, and this is sort of where the Best Damn Webinar Company came from, is we started with someone who actually had experience as part of all 4 groups for many, many years, over hundreds of instances, and realized that this problem was never going to fix itself. It was only ever going to become fixed if someone could look at it holistically and knew how to fix every single problem that's in there. And so that's where we are today.